All right, welcome to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're covering the Great Migration. So the Great Migration was the name for the large wave of African Americans who left the South after the Civil War, mostly moving to cities in the Northeast and Upper Midwest. Today, by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to identify the factors that prompted African American and European immigration to American cities in the late 19th century and explain the discrimination and anti-immigration legislation that also took place during the late 19th century. So continuing to talk about the second half of the 1800s. Lots of things going on. So the Great Migration was this major wave where nearly 2 million African American people left the rural South and moved north over some decades, roughly between 1865 and 1930. They moved primarily to cities in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, and it's known as the Great Migration, largely due to the volume of people that moved. So we're going to talk a little bit about why they left the South and why when they left the South they came to the North. So why leave the South? Well, even after the Civil War, there was intense racial hatred and violence in the South. And we'll talk more about this in other lessons as well. But there was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which was very much like a terrorizing group that promoted violence against African Americans in the South. Even though various laws were passed to try and promote equality and better rights for Black Americans in the South, most of those laws were ignored, or state laws were put in place that provided loopholes for continued discrimination. And there was just a lot of violence in the South as a result of the end of the Civil War and Black Americans being freed. It actually led to a wave of white Americans in the South promoting even more hatred and violence, or just as much hatred and violence against Black Americans as when they were enslaved, and looking for tactics to kind of keep them in submission, essentially. Between 1865 and 1900, there were over 3,500 racially motivated lynchings, which is murder by hanging, with really no consequences. There's, you couldn't do anything about it because the police and the judges and the governors and the mayors of the town were the ones involved in these racially motivated lynchings. So it was very hard to appeal to a higher power for help because the higher power was corrupt and violent. There was also, in addition to all of this violence and hatred, a lack of economic opportunity. African Americans that stayed in the South risked their physical health, risked the future of their family, and so many people decided to leave everything they had ever known and take a huge risk in order for the chance of a better life. So as a result, many of them moved north. And why move north? Well, job opportunities in factories and businesses and the chance to earn wages instead of being tied to landlords seemed like better opportunity. In theory, it was supposed to be easier for Black men to vote and exercise those voting rights in the North without as much risk of their lives, and essentially overall less violence than in the South. That wasn't always the case, but that was ultimately the factors for moving north. These 8 cities received over 2/3 of the migrants. You can think about why particular cities attracted so many people. Tended to do with opportunity, and also as the first sort of round of African Americans migrated north, they would write back to their friends and their family and their relatives and say, hey, this is what life is like where I am. Like, you need to come try it, right? Like, it's not great, or it's not always better. Let me rephrase that. It's not always perfect by any means, but it was better than staying in the South. And so many people moved to these northern cities looking for jobs. And there were usually job opportunities in these cities, even if they weren't the best jobs. So African American men typically worked in lower paying, unskilled or semi-skilled jobs, right? When in competition with a white man, they would receive the lesser job and the lesser wage. Common industries that African American men worked in included the steel mills, mines, construction, meat packing, railroad porters, servants, janitors, waiters, and cooks. These jobs were still often better opportunities than in the South. So even though they were still considered second-class citizens, it was still, for many people, a step up from what they had been experiencing. For African American women, the challenge was even higher, right? They faced discrimination due to both their race and their gender. They had even more limited opportunities, often being stuck in the garment or fabric related industries, laundry related industries, and the vast majority of African American women were employed as maids and domestic servants. Twofold discrimination against them, right? So, the economic realities of living in the North, there were higher wages, but also higher costs of living, rent, food, essentials. Families often lived in overcrowded, unsanitary tenement slums in similar conditions to European immigrants, again considered second class citizens, kind of getting the bottom of the barrel of opportunities. We also see during this time period, in addition to African Americans moving north, one of the largest waves of European immigration that the United States had seen. So between 1900 and 1910, just about 9 million people immigrated to the United States, and the majority of them settled in cities. So there's a lot of competition for housing and jobs. The population of cities is growing far more quickly than the cities themselves can keep up with. And racial prejudice didn't end at the Mason-Dixon line. European immigrants often resented African American workers, saw them as stealing their jobs. Housing discrimination, right? Black Americans were only allowed to live in certain areas, often in the worst slums of the city, which challenged the idea of the North as a quote promised land, which many Black Americans heard the North referred to as that, as a promised land compared to the South, and the reality was not necessarily fulfilling that dream. But again, often it was much better. So why move to the North if the economic challenges were similar to the ones they faced in the South? Well, the answer lies in non-economic gains. Even though economically they might not have been able to have more success than they would have in the South, there were still greater educational opportunities and more personal freedoms than they would have experienced in the South, along with a lesser risk of violence. And so this was often enough for many African Americans who made the trek northward during the Great Migration. So we're going to stop there for today.